Hello. Hopefully by now you've watched the Week 7 intro video and understand what we're going to be talking about today. So let's go with an abbreviated version of Module 11, which does not have exceptions in it, but has the rest of the topics. So we're going to basically talk in this video about how to write to a file and how to read from the file, and then better ways to get the name of the file in a file chooser. So of course, it's a problem if you have to type in data all the time. You want to save data to a file and then read it back in. So the class that we use to do that is called PrintWriter, one of several classes. It's called PrintWriter. It's a class. And so here we've created an object out of the class. We've called it output file. The file that we're reading in is called studentdata.txt. Now, there's a problem here, an administrative sort of problem, because oftentimes what happens is when you're developing code, you'll put the whole path name, like C: Alexander: studentdata.txt. Well, obviously when you send it to me, I probably won't have that same path. I certainly won't have it if you've typed the whole path name in. And that will cause a file not found exception or an IO exception. So the strong recommendation is to just put the name of the file in and then make sure that you submit that file also with the rest of your Java code, and I will. This basically prints to the default location, which I think is in source. It might be one level above source. So this file, studentdata.txt, will be overwritten by PrintWriter. We'll see in a few slides how to prevent it from overwriting, say if you're going to be printing a log file or something. Now, one nice thing about the PrintWriter class is that, of course, it has methods. And so the object created from PrintWriter has these two methods that you're very familiar with called print and printline that system.out has as well. So you can just use them in the same way as print and PrintWriter, except that it'll write to a file. Of course, you need to close the file when you're finished writing. So you also need to import PrintWriter because it needs to be imported because it's not normally in the Java code. As you saw in the debugger discussion last week, it will you will have a compile error when you try to type PrintWriter into the file, and one of the choices will be to import the correct import. Now it may have a lot of other choices too, which you want to avoid. Here's an example of using PrintWriter so that you have some ways to use it. Now, Scanner is a similar program that reads from a file. Now, you've used Scanner before to read from a text string, and Scanner can take a text string. It can also take a file name. So in this case, we're creating a new object called file, called myFile, from the class called file. And we're showing this customer.txt as the file name we want to read from. We have to assume that it already exists in the default location, probably in source. So we're creating this new file object, and we're feeding it, my file, goes into the new scanner object, and then it's called input file. So here's how we use it. These lines of code create a scanner class to read from the keyboard. This one reads from the keyboard, and so you can type in here. It's called keyboard. This one reads from input file, reads from the file, whatever file you entered. So then data can be read using the same methods that you've used to read system.in, keyboard input, next line, next int, next double, and so forth. So the scanner class can throw an IO exception. We talked about exceptions before, last time we met. If you want to hear more about exceptions, you could go to the resource directory in Blackboard under week 7, and Tony Gaddis, the writer of the book, will go through exceptions and exception handling. So the scanner class throws an IO exception when the file object is passed to the constructor. When it has a file object in it, it doesn't throw an IO exception when it's just a string, but when it's a file object, it throws an IO exception. So we could put a throws IO exception clause in the header of the method that calls the scanner class to take care of that problem. So let's assume we've already put a throws clause in the method name that the method header that calls this, and so there's no error. But we want to read to the end of the file, but we don't want to read past the file because that would be a different kind of exception. So we can use has next. Remember, has next is a question. Does it have a next element or next line? And if the answer is yes, this while loop will succeed. If the answer is no, it'll bypass it and close the file. So if it has a next element, it doesn't advance the pointer or anything, but it just answers the question, does it have a next element? If so, then we can read the next line. So here's an example of that same example, basically, with the throws clause in the main method. Of course, this will generate, if you can't find the file, it will generate an IO exception. And then input file is this new scanner with the file name. Now, there was a subtext, a little warning in the earlier talk about PrintWriter that PrintWriter will overwrite normally the whole file that it is calling. If we do not want to overwrite, then we need to use a file writer first. The class file writer is here, and the second argument to it is true. Now, I don't know why you would ever use false. The second argument says you want to append to the end of the file. So I don't know why you would put false in here and not append. Why not just use PrintWriter? But once you've created this FW, this our nomenclature for the file writer, for names.txt, then we pass that as an argument to PrintWriter. And that becomes our PrintWriter object. You can still use the same methods. Now, one interesting thing about Windows is that they use the / character for paths. If you're on a Mac or a Linux machine, it uses a /, But if you're on Windows, it uses a backslash. So you can't just type in one single backslash. You have, because it's an escape character, you have to type in 2 backslashes. Now, Java, this is not a problem at all on Java, because Java has the ability to read forward slashes as well. And so that's a good thing. Now, I mentioned that it would be a problem if you typed in a file path, a path name to a file that didn't exist on my laptop, because on my computer, because I would then not be able to read your file. If you supply the file with the code, with the Java code, let's say you're writing to a text file, and you supply that file, you turn it in along with the Java file, then I can put it in the right place and read it. But the best way to do this is to create a dialog box, which there are dialog boxes like JOption pane, show message, and alerts and dialog classes in FX. But there's also a dialog box called a file chooser, which allows you to browse the file structure and retrieve a certain file. That lets me, when I'm grading, and lets you, when you're developing, choose the right file. So there's a couple things to walk through here. The file chooser has a constructor. You can save a file dialog box, or you can open. Let's user browse for an existing file to open, or you can let's the user browse to the location to save a file. So there's 2 versions: show open dialog. So null normally is the center, just like with Swing and FX in general. The message dialogues, null just says put it anywhere, put it right in the middle of the window. So here's how you use chooser. You set up chooser, you create an object of chooser, and the selected file is after you show open dialog. Then that becomes the selected file, and then you can feed that to Scanner. So here's some code that does it. You can also save the file name, the file, using the show save dialog, and you can browse to the place. So here's an example, the place where you want to save it. Here's an example of reading a file. So they show open dialog, and they read the file. Now is the time.txt, which has this famous quote, "Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country." This is what's in the file, and this is what gets displayed by this code. Now notice that we also put an else if there's no file selected, and that's if the user decides to select the cancel button. We should put a default bailout place. So now we have all this knowledge now, and we're going to decide to create a method called readFile, and it throws file not found exception normally, because that's how it works. And that takes care of the file not found exception that might happen if you're reading a file that doesn't have a good file name. So now let's say you're trying to put this readFile method inside, let's go back one, inside a button handler class. It's called readFileHandler, and it implements event handler. Now we get an error message. Why is that? Well, because it says unhandled exception type. Okay, well, that being knowledgeable about Java, you say, well, I need to put the throws clause in the method handle. But that's still an error. Why is that? Well, because you can't change the signature of the handle method. So we take it out and we get back to that error. So we get this other option when we hover our mouse over the error message, the compile error, and it says surround with a try-catch. Well, that's pretty convenient because when you select that one, it just puts the try and the catch and puts the right exception in there and print stack trace. So now we've taken care of our problem. So that's the video about File IO and some of the little problems it can handle with exceptions. I would suggest that you also look at the Tony Gaddis video, and if you're still, if you missed last Thursday when we talked about the debugger and exception handling, you can look at the Tony Gaddis video. If you're confused about the debugger, you can look at the other video in resources. Both of these videos are links in the resource directory of week 7.